Okay, so I'm going to take you guys through the midterm review activity. Now, as I do this, I'm looking at the actual midterm test, so I'm going to give you information that you really have to know. So remember that the Middle Ages began with the fall of Rome, right? And now, there were many reasons Rome fell. But the main reason you have to know and understand is because a weak central government. The government was weak. It had bad leaders. There was a lot of disorder. So once Rome fell, Europe was put into the Middle Ages. And there's two terms you have to know for the Middle Ages. And one of these terms is something called feudalism. And as you remember, feudalism is a social hierarchy. Now, what does that mean? If you guys remember this activity we did, this is the social hierarchy, if you can see with my mouse. Now remember, in the social hierarchy, the triangle, you have the king on the top. Below the king is the nobles and lords. Below nobles and lords are the knights, and on the very bottom, where most of the people are the peasants. Okay, now what else do you have to remember for feudalism? Remember, it's a social hierarchy, it's a social triangle, it's a class structure, right? Now, why did the feudalism rise again? Is because there was a lack of government. If you remember, in Western Europe, there was no one major empire. So if you take a look at this map, there's not one major empire here. You have a whole bunch of different empires. And that actually led to the manorial system, or the manor. Now, just moving on to Manorialism. Remember, it's the economic system. And the most important thing you have to know for the manorial system is that it was a self-sufficient system, which means there was no trade. Everything was made on the manor. Remember, it has something to do with economy, has something to do with agriculture, because that's what the peasants mainly did. They mainly farmed. Now, remember, just in general, the feudal system, everyone does a favor for everybody. And that can be said for the manual system. Remember that all this is based around land and services. So the king, let's go back to this triangle, the king gives the lords land, the lords give the knights land, and the knights give the peasants protection. And then it goes back around. The peasants give the king, knights, and lords food. The knights give everybody protection, and the lords give the king loyalty. And just moving on now, just keep in mind with the manual system, you're gonna on the midterm, you're gonna get a map, something similar like this. And just understand that manorialism was dominated by farming. That was the main service. Remember, there was no trade. Okay, so moving on to the next question. How was power decided in Western Europe during the Middle Ages? Land. Remember, the amount of land you owned determined if you were a king, lord, knight, or a peasant. It's all about land. Okay, now moving on. So not only was there feudalism in Western Europe, but there was also feudalism in Japan. And now these two societies were very different, but they had very similar ideas. So what you have to know is that both had, so to compare, both had a decentralized government. And what that means is there's no one empire or laws everybody follows. Remember the term, there's many kingdoms. Also, keep in mind, what else you have to know is that both Japan and Europe have a social hierarchy, right? And now we just go to social hierarchy of Japan. Let's find it. Here we go. It's very different from the European social hierarchy, because in the European social hierarchy, peasants are at the bottom, but in Japan, the merchants are at the bottom. And what you have to know is that the merchants were not valued in an agriculture economy. So what does that mean? So keep in mind, in Japan, there's a lot of farming. Each person in the hierarchy depended on farming. So just think of the feudal system. Remember I mentioned, was there a need for trade? There was no need for trade. So that's why the merchants were at the bottom, because they really didn't contribute much to society like the peasants did. And then last, what you have to understand is the codes, right? So for Japan, the Japanese samurai followed the code of Bushido, and the European knight followed the code of chivalry. And what these both mean is that they're just rules of acceptable behavior. And that's important to understand. So even though these rules are different, even though they had different warriors, they both had rules of acceptable behavior. That's why I bolded. You have to know that. Very important.